Thank you very much, Juan, and good afternoon to all of you. I will go through a little bit indeed of where we stand with vaccines and therapeutics. So next slide. This is just the outline of the presentation, and you will see I will try to cover a number of different topics for both vaccines and therapeutics. Next slide. So just as a bit of a summary of where we stand, this is a nice slide because captures what we have been doing throughout these 2 years since the start of the pandemic, including the work done initially for accelerating the evaluation of new products, new or repurposed products for treatment, and also to expedite the development of vaccines as well. And we started with the approval of the Vaccination, which is remdesivir, which was a conditional authorization that was the first one happening in July of 2020. And then we moved towards the end of that year with the approval of the first vaccine, which was Comirnaty, so the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, followed then by Spikevax, the Moderna vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and then the Janssen vaccine. And then all the work done in order to expand the authorization to other population, children in particular, booster doses, and then also additional approvals, particularly in the last part of last year, which cover a number of therapeutics, monoclonal antibodies, immunomodulator agents, so expanding their authorization profile, and also more recently, new vaccines, including the Novavax vaccine called Nuvaxovid, which has been the last one. And the most recent approval is the antiviral called the Paxlovid. And as you know, we still got a lot of work to be done. We still have a number of vaccines and therapeutics in the pipeline. So for the EMA, we will still have a very busy 2022 in terms of approval. And of course, we don't know where the pandemic is going, whether indeed with this Omicron, we are facing a situation in which the pandemic is kind of fading away and entering into a more endemic state. But I think it's a bit premature to clearly state that, and we always have to be prepared that the virus might give us surprises. So we should still continue with all our intense work in advancing all the tools that we have for Europe, but also behind, because I would like also to mention that a lot of the vaccines that we will be considering in the future, and also some that we are considering right now, including Nuvaxovid, are quite important vaccines to expand the supply for low and medium income countries, or for other parts of the globe that have not yet received sufficient amount of vaccines so far. Next slide. As you know, Omicron now is the dominant strain circulating, and a question has always been, are the current vaccines that we're using working sufficiently well against Omicron? And what we've seen based on a number of real-world evidence is that indeed these vaccines, particularly after a booster, still are providing really a good protection from hospitalization and severe COVID-19. Due to the Omicron variant as well. And therefore, this is rather reassuring regarding the fact that what we have right now is still working well and still providing very good protection. As you know, the amount of booster that have been given throughout the European Union is still around 50% or a bit lower than 50%, so not ideal. And therefore, we think we should do more in order to increase the rate of vaccination, both in terms of primary series, as also we should not forget that there is still like more than 25% of Europeans that have not received even a primary series, and in terms of booster doses. So it's very important that we continue making clear what are the benefits of vaccination and why it's so important to get vaccinated, particularly if you are belonging to risk group. So more work to be done here also on the communication side. But again, the bottom line is that a booster dose of the vaccines that we have authorized is doing pretty well in terms of protection from severe disease due to Omicron. Next slide. And so it's important that we consider a timely administration of such booster doses. Each member state is using a slightly different approach here, as you know, which is not making things easier for European bodies like ourselves. There are a number of reasons behind that, but it's pretty clear that at least in adults, it's so important that booster shots are given, and that we increase the amount of people that have receiving such a booster shot. Here is a bit of a summary of the fact of that we already approve booster doses for both the messenger RNA vaccines that we have, but also for the Janssen one. For the Janssen one, the interval is 2 months after the first dose, essentially is a 2 doses schedule with this vaccine. And this is essentially because of the data that they have generated that are showing that a booster shot can be given after 2 months. And there are also efficacy data that showing that this approach would work. And also, as you know, we have been approving extra doses of the messenger RNA vaccines for people with severely weakened immune system from 12 years of age. And our recommendation then would be that for this population, the 4th dose will be the first booster shot and is considered as already recommended. Of course, we don't know for how long this protection will last, and we have seen anyway some data that are showing that there is waning of immunity even after a booster and waning of protection as well, even if protection from severe disease is still maintained over time. So we will be following very closely all the data that are collected in Europe and in other parts of the world to have a better understanding of what could be the next steps in the vaccination strategy here that we should be employing from now on. Next slide. And another important point that has been taken into account by public health authorities in member states and around the world is the use of heterologous approaches. So heterologous approaches, which are also called mix and match sometimes, is indeed using different vaccines either for the primary vaccination series or as a booster. This is a strategy that increases the flexibility in the vaccination campaigns. And also we have seen a number of small clinical trials, but quite solid, coming from academic groups, really showing that this strategy is paying off in terms of the immune response, and also some effectiveness studies that have shown that indeed this could be a very effective strategy in order to increase protection, aside, of course, from allowing more flexibility in the vaccination campaigns. And that's why we already came out before the end of last year with an ETF recommendation. And now CHMP last week started approving heterologous boosting for one of the 2 messenger RNA for Spikevax. So it's an important step forward. Probably will happen for Comirnaty very soon. So it's important that also this recommendation that initially we gave as part of the EMA task force, now they are also taken into account in terms of update in the summary of product characteristics. Next slide. What about children? And also here, as you know, we got a number of updates as well. But to start with, it's true that children are somehow less affected than adults in terms of consequences and burden of disease associated with SARS-CoV-2 infection. But nevertheless, they also end up in the hospital, and some of them also in intensive care units. Some of them, they also present these consequence of the infection with SARS-CoV-2, which is called multi-system inflammatory syndrome. This can be quite a significant collateral disease associated with the infection, causing also hospitalization and admission to the intensive care unit sometimes. So it's very important that we look at the entirety of the burden of disease, also in pediatric population, which as said is less than in adults, but it's not zero. So it's important that we consider also here what we can do in terms of preventing infection with SARS-CoV-2. And that's why vaccines for COVID-19 have been developed in agreement with our pediatric committee, also in the different groups throughout all the pediatric age set. And as you know, we approved initially Comirnaty and Spikevax from 12 years of age. Now, recently, we approved Comirnaty from 5 to 11 years of age as primary series. And last week, CHMP approved also the Moderna vaccine Spikevax for the 6 to 11 group as well as primary series. So we are expanding the possibility of using these vaccines also in pediatric ages below 12 years. And as you know, maybe just to add that also in terms of boosters, CHMP approved the booster for Comirnaty in the adolescents from 12 years of age. And we still have limited data on the impact of Omicron. There is an important study that just came out this week from the United States that shows that efficacy tends to be somehow lower below 11 years of age after a primary series, but the level of effectiveness is pretty good in the adolescents, particularly after a booster, which would show that the vaccines have really a positive benefit risk throughout all the pediatric ages in which an approval has been granted so far. Next slide. And another vulnerable group is pregnant women. Pregnant women were not included in the clinical trials that initially supported authorization for a number of reasons that you are all aware. Before we really have a good understanding of the positive benefit risk in the general population, it's difficult to recruit straight away pregnant women, and we needed to wait at least from the data from the laboratory studies on reproductive toxicity before doing that. But now we have seen, there is somebody that is not muted. Okay, but now we have seen quite a large amount of observational data coming from the use of messenger RNA vaccines during pregnancy, particularly second and third trimester. And these data are really supportive of the fact that not only these vaccines are safe in pregnant women and safe for the children, but also they're highly protective. And it's true that pregnant women with COVID-19 can end up being admitted to intensive care unit, which is something that we hardly see with pregnant women. So it's very important that vaccination of pregnant women is considered, because these vaccines, they work and they are safe. Next slide. So safety, of course, is paramount, and this is the largest vaccination campaign ever done. And what we've seen so far is that overall, the safety of this vaccine is very reassuring. Also, the data from the booster that we have seen so far in large vaccination campaigns are showing that the profile is not at all worse than compared to the primary series of after the second dose. Actually, is somehow better, which is extremely reassuring and is a very important signal, including the risk of myocarditis and pericarditis, particularly in young males, which was a matter of concern for the messenger RNA vaccine. Despite these events are rare, still is something that we followed up quite closely to really understand what is the real incidence and the real risk even after the booster. And indeed, what we've seen so far, particularly from Israel and the United States, is the good safety profile and the lower incidence of myocarditis, pericarditis after a booster shot. So that's very reassuring, as well as the vaccination campaigns. The study in the United States earlier than in Europe, below 11 years of age. And here, again, the data on the safety are extremely reassuring. So good message again. Next slide. This is a snapshot showing exactly where we stand with and sorry about the fact that the slide was not cleaned up, but essentially what you see here is what we publish with respect to the status of therapeutics. So now we are moving into therapeutics, and it gives you really a good overview of the products that have been already authorized in the European Union, those that are in the late stage of evaluation, which is molnupiravir and baricitinib, and those that are under rolling review, which is the monoclonal antibodies cocktail called Evusheld, which has attracted interest because it has activity against Omicron, and in particularly some of the subvariants like the BA2. So you see there is already a good list of products approved, but as said, there will be more coming, and we will update regularly where we stand with all the different therapeutics that we will be approving in the future. Indeed, the one under rolling review and potential authorization are the most advanced one, and we will try to see if we can finalize these procedures as soon as possible. Next slide. Few words about Paxlovid, which has been, as said, the antiviral most recently approved. This is important because it's an oral antiviral, so it's the first one that can be given without too much trouble in the community. as indeed is an oral medicine. And as you know, all the other products approved so far are require an intravenous administration. In some cases also subcutaneous is possible, but still for the monoclonals it's quite complicated to use them out of the hospital. And the main use is indeed in the early phases of COVID-19 in order to prevent progression of disease, particularly in people that are at higher risk of disease progression. And Paxlovid indeed is authorized for this type of indication based on a very successful study. Paxlovid essentially is made by two entities. One is nirmatrelvir, which is the active moiety against SARS-CoV-2, but also there is ritonavir, which is an antiretroviral agent, but is there not because of its antiviral properties, but because it's a PK enhancer. So in other words, it allows the amount of nirmatrelvir to stay in the body for longer and at higher concentration so that it can retain activity for the period that is needed. They are co-packaged, which is also something quite unusual, but we felt important to go down this route in order to allow that the two products are available readily and can be used straight away whenever there is a need. Because one of the most important features here is that for an antiviral to be effective, it should be used as soon as possible after onset of symptoms. And you see here essentially what was the main result from this pivotal study, which was very successful, really high level of efficacy demonstrated by Paxlovid. Even if I think it's important to remind you that these clinical trials was run before Omicron was around. So really we don't have clear-cut metrics to understand what is the effect size against Omicron. But based on what we know, Paxlovid retains activity against Omicron, so we expect that the same antiviral activity will be retained against Omicron as well. And maybe worth mentioning that these clinical trials was run in patients that were not vaccinated, which is another important area that it would be good to collect more evidence to understand what is the impact of vaccination on the efficacy of this antiviral. Next slide. What also is important to mention here is that Paxlovid, because also of the combination with ritonavir, but not only, it faces a number of drug-drug interactions. So in other words, ritonavir is well known to interact with a lot of other medicine because of the effect on the cytochrome CYP3A particularly. And therefore, sometimes it can happen that the concomitant use of Paxlovid with other medicine can cause big differences in terms of exposure to some of the other drugs or to Paxlovid itself. And that's why contraindication have been included in the summary of product characteristic based on all this evidence and what is already known from ritonavir. As an example, it should not be given together with certain antiarrhythmic drugs or certain lipid-lowering agents. But also special warning have been included into the SMPC around the importance of checking any other drug that will be co-administered. And of course, here we are talking about people at higher risk of severe COVID. So essentially people that have other comorbidities or are elderly. And we know that the issue of polypharmacy in this population is an important one. So it's essential that the prescriber takes into account all these elements and make sure that there will be no undue risk to the patient that will be receiving Paxlovid. And the product information and the EPAR are describing very well all is needed to be known around the use of this drug. Next slide. So now moving to something very different. We, as you know, communication is not easy during a pandemic and it's not easy during mass vaccination campaigns. And EMA has been extremely proactive in trying to tackle misinformation, which has been spreading around, particularly since the vaccines have started to be used. And we are doing a lot of work here, and colleagues, Juan and the team there are doing a lot of work in order to, first of all, identify the sources of misinformation, try to understand where this is coming from, addressing queries from members of the public, being active not only via the usual channel, but also going behind that, and collaborating also with both European, but also learned society, international public health bodies, and bodies within the European Union in order to synergize and to make a stronger barrier towards misinformation. It's very important to maintain dialogue with the public. Sometimes, you know, some of the questions are genuine and are really coming from some fear, which you know, we have to understand that. So I think we have tried our best to give feedback to any of the queries that we receive and to try to give all the scientific evidence that could allow everybody to understand why EMA is approving a certain vaccines, why we think the benefit risk is positive, and why public health authorities are deciding in a certain direction in their vaccination campaigns. So I said we have tried to be very proactive here to pre-bank or trying to address the concern before they would proliferate. And we see a lot of them emerging every day still. So we will be continuing with this activity despite it's time consuming, but it's so important that for us is still a big priority. Next slide, and not forgetting the transparency. So, but just to give you a bit example, in particularly on vaccine safety, we have been extremely proactive. First of all, we have seen false reports reporting the number of side effects in ultravigilance as if we're coming from the EMA, which was really a fake. So we tried our best to counteract this type of initiative. But now we're also producing overview of safety updates with really clear-cut statistics on the reported side effects. We have been contextualizing also the number of the suspected side effects with the doses given, and we have been responding to the requests from the stakeholders and yourself as well around increased transparency and enhancing the visibility of the safety updates from the EMA. So big efforts here. Of course, there will be lessons learned. We will try to see what can be done better. And we do believe this is really a critical area. Next slide. And again, about transparency, also the publication of all the clinical data for COVID-19 medicine has been an area where we put a lot of efforts on. This is in progress, and you see here the page from the EMA that you can access, and you can see what is already available in terms of clinical trials and the products that are already included, and you see here what else will be coming in the near future. Next slide. So to conclude, you know, vaccination remains still the pillar that would allow us to get out of this pandemic and to maintain good protection for vulnerable people in the longer term, once that we will still have to live together with this virus, because I can tell you will not disappear. So we will have to think about how to maintain good protection over time, particularly for vulnerable people. We're still seeing quite a number of infections, even if the Omicron wave seems to be going down in many European member states and elsewhere. But we have to be vigilant because we don't know what will be coming next and what other variants might be emerging in the near future. And we have to continue pushing for having higher level of vaccination, both in terms of primary series and booster doses, because still in many European countries, the rate is not very high and should be better. As said, booster doses are fundamental to cope with Omicron. And of course, we are already discussing how to update the vaccines and what can be done. We think that it would be very important to have a vaccination strategy for the autumn and the winter ready during the summer, so that we can think who should receive additional doses and whether the composition of the vaccine should be amended. We got an increased number of safe and effective therapeutics that can be used. They do not replace vaccination, but they are an important complementary tool. And in particular, the Paxlovid as an oral agent is an important addition to the armamentarium. And with this, I think, I don't know if there is maybe another slide. Yes, indeed, the second part of my conclusion are indeed on the misinformation, which, as said, has serious consequences, and we need to combat that altogether. We need to show where reliable information can be found, and as EMA, we are playing our part here, also to increase transparency and access to clinical trial data. We still consider that we need to remain very much engaged with the public and take seriously any request for information that we are receiving. Next, I think that's it. And yes, thank you very much.